The people who swear they will never love are often the ones who have already buried too much. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe the greatest courage is sometimes quieter than a gunshot, don't forget to like and follow. Now, back to the story. The morning sun had barely climbed above the red cliffs when the entire Apache camp gathered in silence. Smoke curled upward from the dying fires, carrying the scent of cedar and sage across the valley. Horses stood motionless beyond the circle, as though even they understood something important was about to happen. At the center stood Ayanna Red Hawk. She was taller than most of the warriors surrounding her, her dark braid falling across a buckskin dress stitched with faded blue beads. A weathered spear rested loosely in one hand, not because she expected a fight, but because she had carried it for so many years it had become part of her shadow. Thin scars crossed her forearms like forgotten stories, earned protecting others rather than proving herself. A young Apache warrior stepped forward. He was respected, fearless, and the son of one of the tribe's oldest elders. "I will wait as many winters as I must," he said quietly. "Stand beside me." The valley became so still that even the wind seemed to pause. Ayanna looked into his eyes for only a heartbeat before shaking her head. No. The word was calm, gentle, final. Another elder tried to persuade her. "You cannot walk alone forever." She answered without raising her voice. "I would rather belong to the mountains than belong to someone who believes I should be owned." No one argued again. The warrior lowered his head with dignity and stepped away, while whispers drifted through the gathered tribe like dry leaves crossing stone. Some believed she had become too proud. Others believed grief had hardened her heart beyond repair. Only the oldest grandmother, watching from the edge of the circle, quietly closed her eyes. She knew Ayanna had buried both parents before reaching adulthood. She knew every promise of love reminded the young woman of everything war had stolen. Strength was not the absence of fear. Sometimes it was simply refusing to lose anything ever again. By late afternoon, Ayanna rode alone into the eastern canyon. She wanted silence. The canyon answered with it. Golden light poured between towering cliffs, painting long shadows across the narrow trail. Dust floated lazily beneath her horse's hooves while distant hawks circled overhead. Everything felt unchanged, until the first rifle cracked through the air. The horse screamed. Another shot echoed from somewhere above the rocks. The animal stumbled violently, throwing Ayanna onto the unforgiving ground. Before she could reach her spear, 3 armed riders emerged from behind towering boulders. Their clothes carried no military colors, no tribal markings, only the cold confidence of men who believed money erased every sin. "Alive," one of them ordered. "She's worth more breathing." Ayanna fought anyway. Her knife flashed once, then twice. A man cried out. Another struck her shoulder with the butt of his rifle, forcing her onto one knee. Blood trickled slowly down her arm. She refused to beg. A loop of rope flew toward her. And then another sound shattered the canyon. Not another rifle. Hoofbeats. Fast. Relentless. The outlaws turned together as a lone rider burst through the rising dust, his weathered hat pulled low against the dying sun. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply rode straight toward impossible odds, as though fear had never learned his name. Ayanna had spent years saying no to every man who tried to claim her. She had no idea that before this sunset disappeared behind the canyon walls, her life would depend entirely on the one man she had never expected to meet. The stranger never reached for his gun first. That was the first thing Ayanna noticed. The chestnut horse burst through the cloud of dust with enough force to scatter loose stones across the canyon floor. Its rider leaned low over the saddle, guiding the animal through a gap no wider than a wagon wheel. He never shouted, never cursed. His calm unsettled the outlaws more than any battle cry could have. The first rifleman turned. "Kill him." The shot echoed against the canyon walls. The cowboy slipped from the saddle a heartbeat before the bullet struck the leather where his chest had been. Rolling across the gravel, he reached for the fallen rifle beside a dead cedar log instead of the revolver resting on his hip. One shot. A rifle flew from an outlaw's hands. Not his life, only the weapon. The second outlaw charged with a hunting knife. The cowboy stepped sideways, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs. Steel clattered against stone. Again, he refused to draw his revolver. Ayanna, still on one knee, watched through blurred vision. Most white men she had encountered believed killing solved every problem. This one fought as though every life still carried weight. The third outlaw circled behind him. "Look out," she shouted. Too late. The rifle stock crashed against the cowboy's back. He stumbled forward, dropping to one knee. Blood appeared beneath the brim of his weathered hat, trickling slowly down the side of his face. The outlaw smiled. 3 against 1. The fight was over. Or so they believed. The cowboy rose again. Slowly, quietly. His blue eyes settled on the men before him with the strange stillness of someone who had survived too many storms to fear another. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said, breathing hard. "Walk away while you still can." The men laughed. One raised his rifle. Another reached for the rope meant for Ayanna. Neither noticed the frightened horse behind them until it kicked with both hind legs. The impact threw one outlaw against the canyon wall. His partners instinctively turned toward the commotion. That single heartbeat was enough. Ethan lunged forward. His fist landed once. Then again. The rope slipped from the third man's hands. Ayanna seized it before it touched the ground. Pain exploded through her wounded shoulder, but she ignored it. She spun low, sweeping one outlaw's legs from beneath him. Dust rose around them in thick waves as his rifle slid beyond reach. The remaining man glanced between the wounded Apache woman and the bleeding cowboy. "This isn't worth dying over," he muttered. Within seconds, the 3 riders disappeared into the maze of red cliffs, leaving only drifting dust and the fading sound of hoofbeats behind. Silence returned. It always did. Ethan bent forward, both hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. Blood dripped steadily from the cut above his temple onto the dry earth below. "You should leave," Ayanna said coldly. He looked up, surprised. "I just helped save your life. I didn't ask you to." "No." He wiped blood from his eyebrow with the back of his sleeve. "You didn't." For a long moment, neither moved. The afternoon wind carried the smell of warm sandstone, sagebrush, and fresh blood through the narrow canyon. Somewhere above them, a hawk cried into the endless blue sky. Ayanna slowly retrieved her spear. Its wooden shaft felt familiar in her trembling hand. She pointed the blade directly at Ethan's chest. "One more step," she said, "and I finish what those men couldn't." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't touch the revolver hanging at his side. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag. Ayanna tightened her grip, every muscle prepared to strike. He pulled out nothing more dangerous than a small strip of clean linen and a weathered tin flask. "Your shoulder is bleeding," he said quietly. "If you don't stop it before sunset, the fever will do their job for them." She stared at the cloth, then back into his eyes. There was no pity there, no triumph, no expectation of gratitude, only simple concern from a man who had every reason to ride away and never look back. That unsettled her far more than the gunfire ever had. Trust is never born in the moment someone saves your life. It begins the moment they expect nothing in return. Ayanna never lowered the spear. The sharpened stone tip hovered inches from Ethan Walker's chest, steady despite the blood running down her wounded arm. Every lesson she had learned since childhood warned her that kindness from strangers often carried hidden chains. "Take your cloth," she said. "Ride home." Ethan glanced at the dark stain spreading across her buckskin sleeve. "If I ride away now," he answered quietly, "you won't live long enough to hate me tomorrow." She frowned. There was no challenge in his voice, no arrogance, only the plain truth. The afternoon heat settled heavily. Inside the canyon, the rocks still held the sun's warmth, filling the air with the scent of dust and baked sandstone. Somewhere nearby, water trickled through unseen cracks beneath the cliffs. Ethan uncorked the small tin flask. "It'll burn." "I didn't ask." "No." He smiled faintly. "But your shoulder did." Before she could answer, her knees weakened. The world tilted. The canyon walls blurred together for a brief second before she caught herself against her spear. Blood loss had stolen more strength than pride would allow her to admit. Ethan took one careful step forward. Only one. He stopped well beyond arm's reach. "You can point that spear at me all evening," he said. "Just don't fall before you decide." The words irritated her, mostly because they were true. Slowly, without lowering her weapon, Ayanna nodded once. "Leave the bandage." He placed the folded linen on a flat stone between them, then stepped backward. Again, he never crossed the invisible boundary she had drawn. Only after several long moments did Ayana retrieve the cloth herself. She examined it carefully. Clean. Fresh. No tricks. No poison. She poured the liquor over the wound. Pain exploded through her shoulder like fire racing beneath her skin. Her jaw tightened, but she refused to cry out. Ethan watched silently. You've done that before, she finally said. Too many times. Army. He shook his head. Cattle. She looked at him with open disbelief. Cattle don't shoot rifles. No. A shadow crossed his expression. But men who steal them usually do. Silence settled between them once more. For the first time, Ayana noticed the old scars beneath the rolled sleeves of his faded shirt. Thin white lines crossed his forearms. Others disappeared beneath the collar near his neck. They were not the marks of someone who sought violence. They were the marks of someone who had survived it. A low rumble echoed across the valley. Both heads turned at once. Not thunder. Hooves. Far away. More than a few. Ethan climbed onto a nearby boulder, narrowing his eyes toward the western ridge. Dust rose above the horizon in a long gray ribbon. That's too many riders. Outlaws. He watched another moment. Before answering. No. His voice grew quieter. They're organized. Ayana felt her heartbeat quicken. The three men from earlier had not been ordinary bandits. They had carried expensive rifles, fresh horses, and matching saddle brands. Someone had hired them. Someone with money. Someone who wanted her alive. She looked toward the distant trail. They'll come back. Ethan climbed down. No. He brushed dust from his hands. They'll bring more. The realization settled heavily between them. Neither spoke. The canyon suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour before. Ethan untied a worn leather map from behind his saddle and spread it across a flat rock. Most trails ended at trading towns or abandoned mining camps, but one location had been marked with fresh charcoal only days earlier. A narrow valley. Hidden springs. Open grazing land. Ayana stared at the drawing. Her expression changed. She knew that valley. It belonged to no town. It belonged to her people. And for the first time, she realized the men hunting her had never been hunting only one Apache woman. They had been hunting the land itself. The longest road is often the one two enemies must walk together. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the canyon walls, painting the sandstone with shades of amber and crimson. Shadows stretched across the narrow trail like silent warnings, while the evening wind carried the scent of dry sage and distant rain that would never reach the desert floor. Ethan rolled up the worn leather map. We can't stay here. Ayana remained still. My people are less than half a day's ride east. And the men chasing you. She looked toward the ridge where the dust cloud had disappeared. They know every trail leading there. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence itself became an answer. If we ride straight to your village, Ethan said, they'll follow us. She hated admitting it. He was right. They want the valley, she whispered. Not me. Ethan nodded. You just happen to stand in the way. Her horse struggled to its feet nearby, favoring one injured leg. The poor animal could barely place weight on its front hoof. Ayana gently touched its neck. You've carried me far enough. She untied the saddle with careful hands and rested her forehead against the horse one last time before sending it toward the open plains. The animal hesitated, then disappeared between towering red rocks. Ethan watched quietly. You love that horse. He was born the same spring my father died. Nothing more needed saying. Ethan adjusted the supplies on his own saddle. Mine can carry us both. I walk. Your shoulder won't. She reached for her spear. It slipped from her fingers. Pain shot through her arm before she could catch it. Without a word, Ethan picked up the weapon. Instead of handing it directly to her, he planted it upright in the ground halfway between them. Another invisible line he refused to cross. Ayana noticed. Against her own wishes, she appreciated it. They started west, choosing an abandoned miner's trail that twisted between broken cliffs and ancient juniper trees. Loose gravel shifted beneath their boots. Every few minutes Ethan stopped to study the ground, reading hoofprints and broken branches with the quiet concentration of a man who had spent his life following cattle across endless country. You read tracks well, Ayana finally said. My father taught me. Your father was a hunter? A rancher? She looked unconvinced. Good ranchers become hunters whenever wolves arrive. A faint smile appeared despite herself. It vanished almost immediately. As darkness slowly gathered, The canyon narrowed until only a ribbon of fading sky remained overhead. Bats slipped from hidden cracks while crickets filled the silence with steady song. Then Ethan suddenly raised his hand. "Don't move." She froze. Only a few steps ahead, the earth had collapsed into an old mining shaft concealed beneath loose sand and brittle brush. One more step would have sent either of them plunging into darkness. "You saw that?" The ground changed color. She stared at the nearly invisible trap. She would have missed it. For the second time that day, the cowboy had unknowingly saved her life. They crossed carefully before continuing deeper into the wilderness. Night finally settled over the desert. Cold replaced heat with startling speed. Ethan gathered fallen cedar branches and struck flint against steel. Soon a small fire flickered beneath an overhanging shelf of rock, its warm glow dancing across the canyon walls. He divided the last pieces of dried venison into 2 equal portions. When Ayanna reached for hers, she quietly noticed something. His piece was smaller. "You gave me more. You lost more blood. And tomorrow? We'll worry about tomorrow. She studied him across the fire. Most men spoke loudly about honor. This one practiced it so quietly it almost disappeared into the flames. Far above them, unseen beneath the stars, another line of riders entered the canyon. This time there were not 3. There were nearly 20, and they were following the same trail. Some truths are too old to reveal themselves in daylight. They wait for the fire. The flames crackled softly beneath the overhanging rock, throwing long shadows across the canyon wall. Cedar smoke drifted lazily into the cold desert air, carrying the comforting scent of burning wood that somehow made the endless wilderness feel less empty. Neither Ethan nor Ayanna spoke for a long while. The silence between strangers had begun to change. It no longer felt sharp, only careful. Ethan sat with his back against a weathered boulder, slowly cleaning the dried blood from the cut above his temple with the last of the water from his canteen. Across the fire, Ayanna quietly tightened the fresh bandage around her shoulder. "You waste water," she finally said. He shrugged. "I've learned blood attracts flies faster." A faint breath escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but closer than either of them expected. The fire settled lower. Above them, thousands of stars slowly filled the black sky, untouched by smoke or city lights. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the cliffs, their lonely voices echoing across the sleeping desert. Ethan reached into one of his saddlebags. "I almost forgot." He pulled out a small leather pouch no larger than his hand. The stitching had nearly come apart from years of use. Inside rested a single silver pocket watch. Old, scratched, carefully repaired more than once. Ayanna watched without speaking. "My father's," Ethan said quietly. "No." He turned the watch over. On the back, beneath years of worn scratches, was an engraving. Not words. A tiny hawk. Its wings stretched toward the sun. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. She knew that mark. Very few outsiders ever had. "Where did you get that?" Ethan looked surprised. "My father gave it to me." "Who gave it to him?" He never said. She slowly reached toward the watch. Her fingers stopped inches away, as though afraid to touch a ghost. "That symbol belonged to our medicine family." Ethan frowned. "My father told me a story once." He stared into the flames instead of at her. When he was 18, he was caught alone during a winter blizzard. His horse died. He should have frozen before morning. He paused. But someone found him. The fire cracked loudly. He woke inside a small lodge. There was an Apache healer. He stayed with them 3 days. They never asked his name. They never asked for money. They simply saved him. Ayanna lowered her eyes. "My mother." The words were almost too soft to hear. Ethan slowly lifted his head. "What?" "My mother carried that mark." She swallowed carefully. "She was one of our healers before the soldiers came." The fire suddenly seemed much warmer. Neither of them knew what to say. 2 families, separated by worlds, connected decades earlier by an act neither side had ever forgotten. Ethan quietly placed the pocket watch back into her hands. "It belongs with your people." She closed his fingers around it instead. "No." He looked confused. "It was given freely." Her voice carried the quiet certainty of tribal tradition. A gift given to save a life must never be taken back. For the first time since they had met, their hands touched. Only for a heartbeat. Neither pulled away immediately. Then, a horse whinnied. Not Ethan's. Both heads turned at once. The sound had come from somewhere beyond the ridge. Another followed. Then another. Too disciplined to be wild horses. Too many to be travelers. The fire instantly became dangerous. Ethan kicked sand over the flames until darkness swallowed the last glowing ember. The canyon fell silent. Ayana crouched beside the rocks, listening. I count. She stopped. There are more than before. Ethan nodded without looking away from the darkness. I hear 20. Another pause. No. His expression hardened. 25. Then, through the moonlit canyon, a distant voice carried clearly across the cold night. Search every trail. The woman must not reach the valley before sunrise. Ayana slowly closed her eyes. It was no longer a hunt. It was the beginning of a war. Sometimes the hardest choice is not whether to fight. It is deciding who is worth standing beside when both worlds demand you walk away. The voices faded into the distance. 25 riders continued searching the maze of canyons while Ethan and Ayana remained motionless beneath the black stone ledge. The desert held its breath. Even the coyotes had fallen silent, as though the wilderness itself feared being discovered. Only when the hoofbeats finally disappeared did Ethan speak. We move now. Ayana nodded. Night was their only ally. They climbed through a narrow passage where moonlight barely reached the ground. Loose rocks shifted beneath every careful step, threatening to betray them with the smallest sound. Ethan led without hesitation, choosing paths hidden by ancient juniper and towering sandstone walls that had stood for centuries. You know these trails well? Ayana whispered. I've never been here. She looked at him. Then how? My father taught me something. He brushed his fingers across the rough canyon wall. When people are hunting you, don't follow the trail. Follow the land. She remembered those words. They sounded strangely familiar. Hours passed. The cold deepened. Ayana's injured shoulder throbbed with every step, but she refused to complain. Pride had carried her through harder nights than this. Until suddenly, she stumbled. A sharp pain shot through her leg as loose gravel gave way beneath her feet. Before she struck the rocks below, a hand caught her wrist. Firm. Steady. Ethan pulled her back onto solid ground. Neither of them spoke. He released her immediately, not because he wanted to, because he understood she valued her independence more than comfort. For the first time, Ayana did not step away. They continued climbing until the canyon opened onto a high ridge overlooking the sleeping valley. Moonlight washed across endless grasslands below. Silver streams wound through cottonwood groves like ribbons beneath the stars. In the center of the valley rested the spring, the oldest spring in the region, the one her ancestors had protected for generations. Ethan stared quietly. So that's what they're after. She nodded. Without this water, she looked across the dark plains. Every ranch within 50 miles survives. So does every Apache village. He finally understood. This had never been about revenge, or kidnapping, or one woman. It was about whoever controlled the only dependable water through 3 counties. Ayana knelt beside the ridge and gently brushed away loose sand. Beneath it appeared old carvings etched into the stone. A hawk, a flowing river, 2 open hands. Our oldest agreement, she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her. What does it mean? She traced one weathered symbol with her fingertips. My grandfather said these marks were carved long before either of us were born. She paused. They remind us that water belongs to no tribe, no family, no man. It belongs to every living thing. Ethan lowered his eyes. So someone forgot. No. She slowly stood. They remembered. They simply decided greed mattered more. A sudden flash of light flickered across the valley. Then another. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Ethan counted quickly. They've reached the western crossing. Ayana's face tightened. That road leads to the settlers. Another lantern appeared farther south. Then another. Within moments, glowing lights surrounded the valley from 3 directions. Not an accident. A plan. They're closing every exit, Ethan said quietly. She looked toward the eastern horizon where her people still slept, unaware of the danger moving toward them through the darkness. If my tribe rides west, and the settlers ride east, they'll meet in the valley. Neither finished the thought. They didn't need to. Fear, anger, and old wounds would do the rest. The men behind this hunt would never have to fire the first shot. They only needed 2 innocent peoples to believe the other had started the war. Ayana looked at Ethan. The distance between Apache and Cowboy suddenly seemed smaller than the distance separating truth from the lie already racing across the frontier. "We have until sunrise," she said. Ethan tightened the strap around his rifle. "No." He watched another line of lanterns appear below. "We have until someone fires the first bullet." Wars rarely begin because ordinary people want them. They begin because someone profits when ordinary people stop listening. The eastern sky had just begun to fade from black into deep blue. Dawn was still hidden beyond the mountains, but the valley below was already awake. Smoke rose from the settlers' ranches as families prepared morning fires. Across the river, far beneath the cottonwood trees, faint columns of smoke drifted upward from the Apache camp as hunters gathered their horses for another day. Neither side knew the other was only hours away. Neither side knew they had already become pieces in another man's plan. Ethan lowered the spyglass he had carried since his cattle-driving days. "They're moving." Ayanna followed his gaze. Along the western ridge, nearly 30 armed riders spread into 3 separate groups, careful to remain out of sight from both the ranches and the Apache village. "Professional, patient, disciplined. They're hurting people," Ethan said. "Like cattle." Ayanna's eyes hardened. "They want both sides to meet at the spring." She understood immediately. The spring was sacred to her people. It was also the only dependable source of water for every ranch through the valley. If frightened settlers reached it first, they would think armed Apache warriors were attacking. If Apache riders arrived to defend it, they would see armed white men occupying their sacred ground. Fear would finish the rest. Ethan folded the spyglass. "We split up." She looked sharply toward him. "No, it's the only chance. You warn the settlers. I warn my people." He shook his head. "You'll never reach them before those riders. And you will. I only have to convince one sheriff." She almost laughed. "You think men carrying badges listen better than warriors?" "No." A tired smile crossed his face. "They're just as stubborn." For the first time since they had met, Ayanna smiled openly. Only for a heartbeat. Then it vanished. The moment ended as a rifle cracked somewhere below. Both turned instantly. A lone ranch hand had spotted one of the hidden riders. He waved his hat, trying to call toward another ranch. The second shot came before he could shout. His horse bolted across the field. The rider disappeared into the tall grass. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It starts now." Without another word, he sprinted downhill. Ayanna followed. Branches whipped against their faces as they raced through scrub oak and loose sandstone. Gravel slid beneath their boots while the first rays of sunrise spilled over the distant cliffs, bathing the valley in beautiful golden light that mocked the violence about to unfold. They reached the lower trail just as 3 masked gunmen blocked the narrow pass. "There they are." One outlaw leveled his rifle. Another smiled. "The boss said the Apache woman dies first." The shot echoed. Ethan threw himself sideways. The bullet shattered the trunk of a cottonwood where Ayanna had been standing a heartbeat earlier. He never reached for his revolver. Instead, he seized a fallen tree branch and slammed it into the rifleman's hands. The weapon spun into the dust. Ayanna moved like flowing water. Her spear swept low, striking another outlaw behind the knees before he could reload. He crashed onto the rocky trail, gasping for breath. The third man drew a pistol. He aimed directly at Ethan's back. Ayanna saw it first. There wasn't time to shout. There wasn't time to think. She stepped between them. The gun fired. Pain exploded through her side. Her body staggered, but she remained standing. Ethan turned just in time to catch her before she struck the ground. For one endless second, the entire valley became silent. Blood spread slowly across Ayanna's buckskin dress. Ethan looked into her pale, determined eyes. "You said," he whispered, struggling to steady his voice, "you trusted no man." She managed the faintest smile despite the pain. "I still don't." Her fingers weakly closed around his wrist. "But," another breath, "I trust you." Ironwood Creek forgot the sound of celebration. It remembered only wind, old grief, and the slow creak of weathered porches settling beneath another sunset. Yet on that evening, every storefront stood open. Every hat rested over every heart. Not because a hero had returned with gold, not because an outlaw had finally fallen, but because the truth had arrived without firing a single shot. The courthouse steps where Elias had once stood alone were now crowded with ranchers, merchants, widows, and children who had watched everything unfold from a safe distance. They looked different now. Not because their clothes had changed, but because shame had a way of lowering even the proudest eyes. Sheriff Nolan removed his badge. He held it in both hands before walking toward White Feather. I judged your people before I judged the facts. His voice barely carried above the wind. I wore this badge for 23 years. Today I finally learned what justice actually weighs. White Feather looked at the old badge for a long moment before gently closing Nolan's fingers around it again. Then keep wearing it. Silence spread farther than applause ever could. The old sheriff's shoulders trembled. For the first time in decades, the badge seemed heavier than steel. Beside the courthouse, children who had once hidden whenever Apache riders appeared now wandered curiously between the horses. One little boy stretched out a cautious hand toward an elderly warrior whose scarred face looked carved from desert stone. The warrior smiled. From a leather pouch, he removed a tiny carved wooden hawk. He placed it into the boy's palm. No speeches followed. No treaty needed signing. Sometimes peace began with something small enough to fit inside a child's hand. Elias stood near the hitching rail, quietly repairing the broken leather strap that had nearly cost him everything days before. Dust still covered his boots. His shirt remained patched where the knife had torn through the fabric. Nothing about him looked heroic. Sarah walked beside him carrying the faded blue blanket that had started everything. You should keep it, she whispered. He smiled. It was never mine. Together they carried the blanket to White Feather. The old chief accepted it with both hands, then folded it carefully as though it were made of silk instead of worn wool. This is no longer a blanket, he said softly. It is a promise. The evening sun settled behind the mesas, bathing Ironwood Creek in amber light that softened every scar left by fear. The merchants reopened their stores. The ranchers rebuilt broken fences together. Apache riders and settlers shared the same well without anyone reaching for a weapon. Not because history had disappeared, but because someone had finally chosen to remember each other before remembering old hatred. Long after the crowd drifted home, Elias remained sitting alone outside his barn. The prairie stretched endlessly before him. Wind brushed across the tall grass like distant whispers. White Feather approached one final time. Without a word, he removed the small eagle feather tied to his own necklace and placed it into Elias's weathered hand. No tribe owns honor, the chief said quietly. It only chooses where to live. Then he mounted his horse and disappeared into the fading horizon alongside his people, leaving only drifting dust glowing beneath the last light of day. Elias watched until the riders became silhouettes, then nothing at all. He closed his fingers around the feather. Far away, a lone hawk circled above the valley before vanishing into the western sky. Out here, justice never needed the loudest voice. It only needed one quiet soul willing to stand still while everyone else stepped backward. And in the Old West, that kind of courage outlived every gun ever forged. Years later, travelers still slowed their horses when they reached Ironwood Creek. Not because the town was famous, not because treasure had ever been buried beneath its streets. They came because old stories traveled farther than stagecoaches, and this was one of the rare places where people claimed justice had arrived without leaving a single grave behind. The barn where Elias had once repaired saddles still stood against the endless prairie. Its walls had faded beneath decades of rain and relentless sun, but one thing remained. Untouched. Above the entrance hung a single eagle feather. No sign explained it. None was needed. Every child in town knew why it was there. The children had become the true keepers of the story. Whenever strangers asked, they never spoke first about the confrontation, the accusations, or the frightened crowd. They always began with the blanket. The blanket was old, they would say. It wasn't worth much. Then they would smile. But it changed everything. Years passed the way they always do on the frontier. Slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. New families settled the valley. Old graves welcomed familiar names. The railroad eventually pushed farther west, bringing noise where silence had once ruled. Yet something remarkable refused to disappear. The habit of suspicion had become the habit of listening. When disagreements broke out over grazing land, people gathered around tables before reaching for rifles. When strangers rode into town wearing different clothes or speaking unfamiliar languages, children greeted them before adults judged them. The change had not come from laws. It had come from memory. Sheriff Nolan served until his final day. When he eventually passed away, The townspeople buried him wearing his badge. Inside his coat pocket rested a folded scrap of paper. Only after the funeral did his daughter unfold it. Written in careful handwriting were only 8 words. Facts first. Fear never again. She framed the note instead of hiding it. It still hangs inside the rebuilt courthouse. Sarah became the town's schoolteacher. She taught reading, arithmetic, and history. But once every autumn, she carried the same faded blanket into her classroom. She placed it across an empty chair. The children always stared. Then she asked the same question. What do you think this is worth? Some guessed $5. Others guessed 10. She always shook her head gently. No, it was worth an entire town learning how to become better. None of the children ever forgot that lesson. As for White Feather, no one knew exactly when he crossed into the spirit world. One spring, the Apache riders simply stopped mentioning his journeys. But every year, on the first morning, after winter finally released the valley, someone quietly tied a fresh eagle feather beside the old one above Elias's barn. No witness ever admitted doing it. No one asked. Some traditions remained stronger without explanation. Elias himself grew old exactly as he had lived, working before sunrise, speaking only when words mattered, offering help before advice. Visitors often expected to meet a legend. Instead, they found an aging rancher mending fences with rough hands and dusty boots. If they thanked him for saving the town all those years ago, he always answered the same way. I didn't save it. They chose to save themselves. The prairie accepted another sunset. Golden light rolled across the tall grass. Somewhere beyond the distant mesas, a hawk circled once before disappearing into the endless western sky. The wind carried the scent of sage, leather, and dry earth exactly as it always had. The West had never truly belonged to the strongest man, nor to the fastest gun. It belonged to those rare souls who could stand in the middle of fear and refuse to let fear decide who deserved kindness. And perhaps that is why, long after every witness had faded into memory, the people of Ironwood Creek remembered not the day justice defeated hatred, but the quiet afternoon when one warned.